Beth, thanks. Well, I appreciate the shout out. We always hope that people who read it feel like we're just sitting down at the table talking, because that's kind of what we were going after. And I will share that I am so honored to be joining you for this conference. I really wish I was in your beautiful state. I also am a fellow Oregonian. I saw the names were popping through too quick, but I saw Kelly was on. Hi, Kelly. And it's always nice to come back to the beautiful Northwest. So while I am a Jayhawk now, I'm always a duck first. And really glad that you have interest in talking about MTSS, ensuring all really means all, or ensuring each and every. So I am at the Swift Education Center, and we had the good fortune for about 5 years of having a very intense focus on MTSS, with a particular spotlight on MTSS and students with the most extensive support needs. And we were able to work across 5 states and 16 districts within those 5 states. So much of what I'm bringing to you today comes from that which we've learned from our partner sites across Vermont, New Hampshire, Maryland, Mississippi, and your fine state of Oregon. So some of you may recognize some of the lessons learned, or it might resonate with you. And I hope it generates really good thought and reflection and conversation, even though we have a relatively short period of time together. Just please know that at the Swift Education Center, are the words we live by. Believing together we can transform education so it benefits each and every student, their families, and ultimately the communities in which they live. And we have a nice track record with our partner sites in doing so. And we are deeply committed to a future where students' race, ethnicity, SES, language, or disability status don't predict learning and life outcomes, and hope that you stand with us in that work. So for our time together, we really want to make sure that what is being shared allows you to affirm the strengths that you have in your system, as well as time to just be able to think about this topic, be able to reflect. And my goal is that you have some takeaways, either in terms of actions, in terms of conversations, or people that you want to extend this discussion with. And Beth, remind me, we are going to half past the hour, the next hour, is that right?
I believe so. I will double check and message you.
Oh no, I think
Yes,
that's right. I just wanted to, as I'm watching, I was 15 minutes off last time when I was with a group, and I felt really bad.
Nope, we're good.
Okay, so for our grounding today, I wanted to do something just to bring us into this space, and knowing that we have a small amount of time, I'm going to limit it to just finding out like where you guys are at with implementation. It helps me as I think about what has been put together. And so Lisa's going to launch a poll that asks where you're currently at with your MTSS implementation efforts. And you could please ORTIi, MTSS, where you're at. And you can see I came up with 4 categories. Just pick that which best represents where you're at. Great. I'm still watching the numbers click in pretty quickly, so we'll wait until they pause. Good.
And this is completely anonymous, so you can feel free to vote.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for reminding them of that. Yeah, we just kind of want a sense. Looks like right now, the majority have been at it for some time, a nice chunk just beginning, and we have quite a few people that are here learning about it. Fantastic, welcome. And some folks that consider themselves veterans with the work. Wonderful. Okay, great.
Do you want me to
helpful for me?
Do you want me to publish? I can just publish
that's
it
great.
really quick.
For everyone to see. Yeah.
Can everybody see that? All right. Yeah, like that middle chunk is quite significant. So,
Yeah,
all
nice,
right.
wonderful. Thank you for doing that. All right, so those of you who have been at it for some time, I think that this quote will resonate well with you, because the work of MTSS really is about creating those hospitable environments for all of our students to learn and thrive in. And it really requires us to be able to reflect on the learning systems that we've set up. And so I like kind of entering into any conversation with MTSS with an attention to that which we do in the as the adults in the system in establishing that. I want to share, those of you who really dig the research around MTSS, and I have to say I love being able to present. I think I put together 4 more recent research findings, because those of us, and I know there's 5 self-identified veterans in the group, those of us who have been at this for any length of time, for a long time, got questioned about what's the research behind MTSS or RTI, what's the research behind it? And for a long time, we had to rest on the research that supported the practices that we would characterize as representing RTI or MTSS. We really didn't have the research on the system of RTI or the system of MTSS. And that research base is continuing to grow. And I'm so proud to be able to share where we're at with that. So a few pieces that are of more recent, that especially as we enter into this discussion around ensuring that all really means all. One comes from a couple of fairly recent research that's coming out of our work with the 5 states. And that is that the work that's been grounded in equity-based MTSS is positively and significantly affecting the academic performance of all student groups. And so that's a really important piece that we need to see, that it's worth our time and our effort. One that's in preparation that we're really excited about contributing to the literature is that as we see the implementation of equity-based MTSS with higher degrees of fidelity being implemented, is being positively correlated with educational equity. That is, that we're seeing that the proportion of academic variance that has been associated with race, SES, and gender is reducing. And so that is an important piece that we're really pleased to be seeing. You all in Oregon have known this one for a long time with the work and the leadership around PBIS in particular, but that is students in high need schools are significantly reducing suspension days per 100 students with implementation, meaning more students in school, gaining more instructional time. So that's a piece that we're pleased to continue to be able to offer to the literature. And then this one, and for those who have lived in the research for students with more extensive support needs, students with big labels, this needle has been really hard to push. And some of our work, and under the authorship and work with Jenny Kurth, that schools focused on implementing MTSS with an emphasis on students with the most extensive support needs, are significantly increasing the proportion of time students with IEPs are alongside their grade and age level peers in the general education environment. So that needle has been super hard to push, and for us to see those gains over the course of 5 years was really exciting. So I think all of these citations and some of the hot links directly to the articles are found at swiftschools.org on the shelf. So please check them out, and it's nice to be able to continue to share. So I've thrown in there that the term equity-based MTSS, and I just want you to know where we're coming at that from and give you pause for what that means to you, what that means to your work as your district or your site or your agency is engaging in the work of equity. So I'm going to share a pretty 25,000 foot above ground view of MTSS. And you can see our definition here: continuum of research-based system-wide practices of database decision-making used to meet the academic and behavior, and we include social emotional needs of all students. Please know that this is probably consistent, directly consistent with most any system that you work in around MTSS. And that term research-based, we include that as a base continuum of research-based system-wide practices, because especially for students with the more unique or low incidence populations, we may not have the level of research for it to be called evidence-based at this point in time. We look for evidence-based to the degree that that is available, but certainly research-based at a minimum. So I kind of call this the technical definition of MTSS, and I want to put that in the context of one definition of equity. And I'm going to read this one out loud, and I would love to see in the chat, what words are standing out to you in this definition of equity. The definition where each and every student in a community is welcomed into a system of teaching and learning that is fluid, responsive, dynamic, and alive, and uses all available resources to meet student needs. I know every time I read that, and I've read it like hundreds of times, every time I read it, it depends on where I'm at in the work, what teams I've recently been with, where my own children are at in their schooling experience. So I'm interested. So first one, I see fluid, responsive, welcome system without the S. Very good. Good. Welcome is standing out. Community stands out. Community welcomed and responsive. Great, Janice. Welcomed, available, fluid, each and every. This conversation, oh my gosh, I do not know how people added the hearts to that, but that is really awesome. Okay, new Zoom trick for me to figure out how to do. This is worth its own conversation in your site, because when we have time for people to elaborate on why those words stand out, it becomes a really powerful combination for a conversation around equity and MTSS. And, we're evolving in this work. We keep going deeper and deeper. Amy McCart and I were just having a conversation about that this morning of, the book really provides a nice entry point into it. But we need to double and triple down on the work of equity with MTSS and look forward to continuing to go there. One of the pieces that I think about when I think about this is, that technical definition of MTSS. This is where you really start to bring it to life. You start to really be able to see how this can change systems when you put it in place. And that's what we look for it to do. A few words I want to call out, and two of the bullet points were part of that definition directly. Several of you had noticed the word welcomed as it stood out to you, and thinking about how would students know that they're welcomed into the system of teaching and learning? What would that look like? What would that sound like? And what would that feel like? Especially being able to recognize those things that we do that increase the likelihood that the students see our environments and feel our environments as welcoming, and those that may unintentionally serve the opposite. But I want to draw attention to this second bullet point, and it's not part of our definition on the slide yet, but I think it's becoming increasingly important to me that it become part of our definition. And that is thinking about the degree to which we understand the students before us. One of the strengths I think we have with MTSS is that we are data-driven, and in thinking about every data point representing a student and their name and and who they are, and helping us draw that out really enhances our ability to use what we know about them to be able to make better instructional and environmental decisions in meeting their needs. So this piece around understanding them, understanding their name, understanding their story, understanding their needs in a way that we can really make MTSS be what it needed and needs to be for them. So with that, however you characterize MTSS as your visual or RTI, and I saw behind Lisa her inverted triangle. So, you know, you can imagine that in the center. I just want to walk you into this piece around those of you who had been just learning about it or early with implementation. You know, you have the opportunity to think about designing the system that you want right from the get-go, thinking about students who have historically been most marginalized. Those of us who are in the veteran category and at it for some time, we might have to think about kind of like a reflection and redesigning of our system to ensuring that it is meeting each and every. So now I want to walk you through some of the lessons that we've learned that might give you food for thought about what that journey might look like for you, or some of the things that you want to discuss. In doing so, I'm going to bookend our time together with this equity report card. I have the QR code that should take you to it. I also made it available as a recommended to print resource. You have both pages on there. And you can really think about every one of these. These were kind of the culminating pieces from the questions to take it to the team part of the book. And we kind of culminated it in what we call the equity report card. But any one of these, I think, can serve as a really nice discussion point for those of you who are learning and early in your implementation. Those of you who are veteran and advanced, you can think about it kind of being a let's revisit. And you can almost take any one of these and then add the tag on of students with the most extensive support needs. So I'm not going to do the first one, but let's do the second one. Like, I, as an individual, recognize that all students can learn and that I have an active role in their learning, especially students with the most extensive support needs. So if you tack that on, it changes that piece and it focuses in a little bit more directly in thinking about students with significant disabilities. And you could actually do that with any group that has been traditionally marginalized, or whatever the population that has not represented all, meaning all, in your particular site. So I'm going to bookend with that, but that's kind of a setup. So when we think about the load-bearing walls of MTSS, we usually think about the infrastructure parts of designing the system that include attending to the teaming structures that make the work happen, the data systems that allow us to make data-driven decisions, our attention to our evidence-based curricular and instructional practices, and then some way of having a continuous improvement or problem-solving approach that allows this to be a dynamic decision-making process for our school, for our universal supports or tier 1, for our additional supports or tier 2, and what it looks like around individual students at tier 3. So I'm going to kind of give reflections across these different areas as I talk about lessons learned. And so hopefully that you'll recognize that. All right, so let's talk about first some of those lessons learned and a recommendation around the all really means all, with an attention to students with significant disabilities or those with the most extensive support needs. So here's some of our lessons learned, and let's see what this makes you think about. One of the first ones was making sure that we have a real clear and explicit expectation that all students participate in and with the general education curriculum. And in some places, that has been something that was always thought to be the explicit expectation, but over time, it kind of becomes something that becomes negotiable. So the one district, they thought that was always an explicit expectation, but then over time across sites, that became a place where people may have pulled students with disabilities to provide their specially designed instruction in another setting with another person, even though it was never supposed to supplant universal or core instruction. So that's a piece that usually is often needed to be revisited. The second lesson learned was around if we're going to make this happen, really elevating the priority and value of collaborative planning so that people aren't having to beg, borrow, and steal time to be able to do the planning that's necessary in order to feel really confident that what we've put together is meaningful and relevant in meeting the student where they're at, whether that's in universal or additional supports. And then this third one is one that we actually just had a fantastic conversation with a partner site last night around the master schedule piece and staffing arrangements. And in this piece, really opening up, thinking about our master schedule as as an opportunity for strategic planning, and around all of our human resources as being variables that we may figure out how to use flexibly based upon their strengths, their talents, and what our needs are. So that's a piece that is really important, I would say, to making this work. And I may address this a little bit later, but I think it's worth saying twice if I do. And I just put a resource, if those of you who checked like last night, if you had access to the e-resources, I just put another resource in there about an hour and a half ago that helps people think through different collaborative teaching structures and how we might think about co-teaching in different ways. So being able to think about co-teaching as it might pertain to only part of a lesson, as opposed to co-teaching kind of like where it's like the whole kit and caboodle, where it's co-teaching pairs that are teaching an entire block together. So just something that might give food for thought for how we might be able to utilize collaborative teaching structures in a different way. And then the last piece, and I'll show you a little example of this in a minute, but that is really revisiting and making sure that all students are included in our data systems. And I'll show you what that has looked like to give you an idea of that. So one of the pieces that was a real game changer, I would say, for some of our partner sites, and I'm going to give you two examples. One, I'm going to be drawing from some of the knowledge development site work that we did in Vermont, where we learned a lot around the evaluation piece to say, for these sites that have really created an equity-based and inclusive MTSS system, what are the things that they do? What does it look like? And then the second one is one where it was a district leadership team who had this as a particular priority. And we used some of the tools, but we went about using them in slightly different ways. And I share this because coming from Beyond Access, and Michael McSheehan has been a very dear colleague and partner in crime in this work for a number of years. And that was that oftentimes with students with disabilities, our focal point has started with that learning part. It started with that learning piece around what are their present levels, what are our goals, what do we need to put in place in order to attend to their academic, behavior, social, emotional needs. And as a byproduct, we hopefully get that participation and membership. And what we found is that we wanted to first start with thinking about the pieces that would relate to membership, the indicators that would increase the ability for participation to be meaningful, and that when you have those two things, then learning becomes more of a byproduct because you've set the groundwork. It's almost kind of like some of the work that people talk about with the climate in their school as being that which really lends itself to that learning experience. So this piece around membership and participation, I chose to spotlight here because I find that that is a really great first step in talking through what does this mean to us when we think about how students are experiencing our tiered system. What does that look like, especially around universal support? So one of the pieces that I put in the electronic resources was an adaptation of membership and participation indicators from Beyond Access. In Vermont, we used this as a kind of a get a picture of what's going on across sites. So we used it as kind of part of an overall inventory or survey for our current reality. And so you can see, like, looking for indicators of membership might be attending general education classrooms, following the same schedule as classmates, attending core content area classes, attending recess, etc. Now, our colleagues in another state that I told you went about it slightly different in Maryland, they actually said, we don't want to look at your indicators first. This is a conversation we want to have as a district level team. What do we expect students in our district to, how do we want them to be experiencing school? And this could have been done at a school level of how do we want them to experience Stillwell Elementary. And what does membership mean to us for a student to be an authentic member in a classroom? What does it mean to have high participation? So they wanted to create their own indicators first, and then they could cross-check it with that which came out of the Beyond Access work. So it was kind of fun that we had the opportunity to see this play out in a couple of different ways. And I just want to share some pictures that came from schools in Vermont to give you a sense of looking at this checklist and then saying, do I see this alive and well in our school? Do I see evidence of this where I could really say, this is all the time, most of the time, some of the time, or none of the time? What would that look like? And so I'm going to take you into Proctor Elementary, the principal, Mrs. Collodi, and into Alex's 4th grade class. And so one of the indicators that that we looked for in using that checklist was, where's your latest yearbook? And to see whether Alex, is listed right alongside his 4th grade peers. That's an indicator of membership. I love showing this because it cracks me up that how messy this is actually 5th grade, the 5th grade cubbies were. But, looking for, does the student with disabilities, and in this case, more significant disabilities, have their cubby right alongside their other classmates? Are their products displayed right alongside their classmates? Again, all indicators of this thing we might call membership. Do we see their names and birthdays displayed right alongside their classmates? Do we see them listed for class jobs right alongside their classmates? So on the day that we went in, these were all pictures that we just snapped across that school to kind of say, are these school-wide practices? Not just ones that we might see in this kindergarten class, because it's this teacher's approach to how students with disabilities are seen as members and participating and learning through the general education curriculum, but is this school-wide? So we went across the whole school. This was a kindergarten class. Do we see students' names listed for the flexible groups and center-based learning assignments? So in this case, Ben was a student with more extensive support needs. Then when we got to the participation piece, some of the pictures that we snapped and some of the indicators we were looking for is, do we have an indication that there are multiple modes of communication that would allow a student to be participating in different aspects of universal instruction? So being able to respond during whole group instruction, being able to engage with peers during small group instruction or different arrangements. And so this was an example of for the student Alex, the fourth grader, and we noted that they had multiple modes. They had the communication cards that could be used. Their smile and their vocalizing was leveraged. They had a partner assisted scanning, and they had a switch access to run a speech generating device. So there were multiple ways that Alex could participate in terms of his communication to the activities. And then one that I like to share because it happened to be occurring while we were there, and that was recognizing that in fourth grade, Alex's desk could be on the floor. But in fifth grade, the arrangements were such that they were really looking for ways that he would be more up at table level the entire time with his peers. So the occupational therapist and general ed teacher co-taught a unit where they asked the kids to create the design options. Like, you guys have been with Alex all year. What could be different ideas that we might consider, knowing what the expectations are in fifth grade? And I just love the first student that wrote the party bus for Alex's bed and what that might look like. And then in getting at that participation piece and learning, this was a kindergarten example of recognizing that in this case, it wasn't about Ben being able to write the numbers in terms of thinking mathematically and having that number sense. It was about him doing that thinking. And so they had pre-populated stickers that had already filled in the writing parts that he could use to complete the same activity that other kindergarten students were doing. So it's kind of thinking about those indicators and then what would they look like? So taking an inventory of your current reality, not just about thinking of the learning piece, but thinking about the membership, thinking about participation, those two things being setups for that learning environment to be rich. A couple more, this was from the fifth grade, kind of thinking about one of the indicators we saw was rubrics. Learning targets were readily available. They were built into the work materials. And in the case of the formative assessment, they had written down the progression of the math standards so that students may be entering at somewhere along the progression. So that was a real asset at fifth grade. So during this math instruction, just so you have a sense of some of the things that we saw, and this is where I was going to come back to that co-taught part. There was co-teaching during partial part of the class. And so it might have been in some math instruction, it might have been when new concepts are being introduced, where it might be a co-teaching partner. It might be just during the independent work time. So it doesn't have to be for the entire math block or instructional block. It may be depending upon the student, the data, what would make the most sense for how we use our human resources. They had direct instruction with models and checks and partner work. And the partner work, I would say, really shines as a natural opportunity for that peer support that we maybe don't lean in enough on sometimes. That was really important. There was small group work and then teachers circulating and checking in with different individual students, probably familiar to most of you who are at the site level. And then this last picture, I just want to give you a sense of that piece of what does it look like to revisit and think about all students being included in your data system. And so this was an example of how it was laid out. But our piece that we usually reinforce is we want to make sure we have, in this case, we're doing literacy. We want to have a literacy profile on every student. And so in creating that literacy profile, there may be some students that we might be using a screening tool that requires a verbal response. And we may have some students whose communication is nonverbal. So how do we make sure that they're represented, that we have that profile on them? And so while many of our reports might come out, so like this one might be an Acadience report that has how students are doing in their phonics, their phonemic awareness, use fluency, vocabulary piece on here. But for students whose communication is nonverbal, like Puneet and Jackson, we still want to represent how are we learning about their vocabulary needs. And it may be different ways of gathering that information that are non-traditional. It may be that we really don't have the evidence around our data decision rules, but we have to be able to say we do the best we can with the information we have at the time. And as we learn more, then we adjust. But being able to ensure that we represent in some way, Puneet and Jackson on here really allows that 100% meeting to be 100% meeting, in this case, in first grade. So there's some lessons learned around universal support in, and I'll take a breath. I know some of you are like, oh my gosh, I am processing about 4 paragraphs behind her. And so I apologize, and knowing the wide range, I'm kind of hoping to put some thought out there that can land depending upon where you're at. So let me pause and see if there's anything urgent that you want me to be revisiting now in the chat. Lisa Beth, anything coming up?
I'm not seeing any questions. So I think so far, like just even that last slide was to me super valuable, because I've been in situations where certain kids, we just didn't include their data. So that was great. Thank you.
Yeah, I right alongside you for lots of years, and it always bugged me, but we just, again, we do the best we can with the information we have. And as we grow and we mature, then we always reflect upon our system. All right, well then let's talk some about what we've learned as we think about tier 2 or additional supports. So some of the lessons learned here, and I know in Oregon you talk about response to instruction and intervention, and you've always had all students on there. If people start using a multi-tiered system language, I like to point out that it's one system. There's no S on systems, it's one system. So in a way, talking about your response to instruction and intervention, you don't even have the opportunity for people to address a misrule of thinking about systems. So kudos. But on here, when we think about creating a system, this notion of all students being included in the process is really important. And I think historically, oftentimes, if we have students who have been receiving additional supports in whatever area, they might already have an IEP, they might be receiving additional supports if they're learning additional languages, if they have particular needs for whatever reason. And oftentimes people have said, oh, well, they already are receiving supports. One of the things we really want to do is we want to create an integrated and inclusive system. So it's this piece about looking at all students in the process of saying, what does their profile tell us? What do their data tell us their needs might be? What do we know about them, so that we can make good matches and we can consider all students in that process that might allow us as the adults to think differently about who's doing what with that. When early on, when I started in the process, we had special educators that might be doing something with PALS, and we had general educators doing something with PALS, and they were almost at the same place, and they were duplicating that only because these students had IEPs and these students didn't. So this all students included in the process allows us to just put out there what our data are telling us. Kind of, I do this a lot because I always loved little data cards that I could move around, because it allows people to think differently when you move cards around. And saying, well, what does that group look like? Does this really represent what they need? Irregardless of the services and supports, that frees us up saying, who's in the best position to be able to lead this group, or to be able to meet these kids' needs. And so it helps with that piece around the second bullet point of 1, matching to need really clearly, So not matching to an identified label or service. So matching to need. And two, really leaning in on who's in the best position of leading that group rather than this is what I do by my role. It's, wow, I might really want Beth to lead this group because she has the best relationship with one of the students in the group. And that's really going to be more important than it is that the reading specialist is doing that group. So it's kind of freeing us to think, freeing us up to be able to think differently about how we're utilizing our human resources. And then this last one was always one that really drove our work, and that is thinking about the most highly expert works with those most in need. So for our students with the most extensive support needs, the most extensive learning needs, we want to match that with the most highly expert. And that may make us rethink how we're using our people in our systems. So those are some lessons learned around additional supports. And this last piece, because I want to be able to show you some video clips, this last piece is one that's really near and dear to me, and that I've spent a lot of my professional career, it feels like, really examining and trying a lot of things that haven't hit the mark, and finally landing on something that I have felt has been the closest to creating a system of continuity for instruction than I've experienced to date. So the lessons learned here are to think about the continuity that you have for instructional planning that can be across one system. So it's how do we start from, and I always said the general ed teacher was the center of the universe. That made my best friend, Terry, who was a first grade teacher, really happy. So we started from the classroom teacher being the center of the universe, and then saying, how is it that that instructional planning begins? And then how can we build off of that so that as we deepen our understanding of that student, as we think about our response as a system to that student, that we are all the way deepening rather than changing the process for how it is we go about customizing our instruction. So let me back up and give you some examples, because it's going to play off of you recognizing that when we talk about tier 3 and we talk about intensifying support, it is a verb and it's not a noun. So we are figuring out how to intensify our support, not thinking about a different person, place, or thing that we might match. So let me share with you some examples of what that looks like. And these are truly just examples. You think about what you have in place that of what it might look like. The first part was, how do we start building a learner profile that helps us understand what we know about that students in terms of their learning strengths as well as their learning needs. And so I share with you, this one is in literacy. I share with you just something fairly simple at the elementary level. I swapped the order for secondary, although I still included all of these areas to have a picture of what we know about that student. This started backing up, while this was utilized when we originally were doing individualized planning, our grade level colleagues or our classroom level colleagues started to say, well, this is how I should be explaining a student's learning strengths and needs at parent-teacher conference. This should be like how I'm showing a family member, this is your child as a reader or as a mathematician, and being able to break down how I share what I know about them. So then when you back it up to that point and we start there, then everything we continue to gather about that student just allows us to go deeper. Now we've learned something else. If we're providing additional supports for that student and we're monitoring progress and reviewing it, we're learning something else about the student. So it becomes kind of a profile that we build over time so that when we become to the intensifying level, we really have a rich profile to work from that allows us to make those adjustments in a way that we increase the likelihood that we're really getting at what is going to accelerate this student's learning. The second part is working from that which the general ed teachers plan from, kind of as our basis for universal supports. So we kind of went back to, how do you lesson plan? And I'm just giving you an example that we affectionately called our 5-day planning form, because it was what, in this case, in literacy, they followed. So there was basically a 5-day routine that was fairly predictable across the year. And it kind of laid out. Day one, we introduce the concept, then we have listening comprehension, then we have vocabulary, then we do a shared read. You can see how this goes. In math, it was usually by a unit of study. And at secondary, sometimes those units of study might cross several weeks to over a month. So depending upon what it looks like, it's how do you plan your instruction. When we were able to work from that as our starting point, then we could ask the question, if we needed to intensify, I would take each of these individually and say, do we see any disengagement with the student during this part? Does the student get frustrated, or is there a skill mismatch? And those 3 questions tended to lend themselves really nicely to talking about what the teacher sees and giving us ideas for how we might differentiate for that student within that part. So again, does the student get frustrated, disengaged, or is there a skill mismatch? Those were kind of the 3 golden questions. When we talked through each of these, that became a replicable process for collaborative lesson planning, that over time, a lot of the things were the same. And it wasn't just talking about what we might do that might pertain to one aspect of literacy instruction, but could really make sure that we've talked through that individual student across a unit of study. So I'm sharing with you, this came from Mrs. Woolley, and she had hers all typed up. They had it as a shared, I don't think it was a Google Doc, but it was something like that they typed it up. But this, you can see down the right hand or left hand side, those were the components that were fairly predictable. Word knowledge, phonics, story and comprehension, this comprehension skill, vocabulary, and then they tied in their SEL emotion words. And then across the 5 days. And so then their collaborative planning just would go in and say, for this particular student, is there anything that might be a little different in terms of what we want to emphasize or what we want to do? And I know that for this student, I remember the genre for this grade level was fantasy. And this was a student that was still working on understanding the concept of real versus not real. So there were some things that they were doing that the student would still have access to the story, but they were still trying to make sure that they understood, Superman wasn't real, and Bobby in the story is a real character. So that's what that looked like. Now I'll show you one that's a little bit messier related to intensifying additional support. And with additional support, we took that concept of like, what's the standard lesson planning mat, right? What does it look like for our intervention supports? So I'm just sharing with you 4 examples. And I should upload, I have all of these as Word documents. So to keep you from reinventing the wheel, you are welcome to take these and modify them. If you're using any of these, I fairly guess that our breakdown template is probably still the same unless they've changed the intervention. So you can see examples for do the math, teacher directed PALs, read naturally, and check in, check out. We basically said, what are the predictable components that would be involved in doing that intervention? And then we could do that same talk through of, okay, during do the math, is there frustration, disengagement, or is there a skill mismatch? That allows us to do problem solving in a way that allows us to intensify or customize the intervention for the student. And now I'll show you the messy one. So this is what it looked like when we were doing it, and we were facilitating it with, actually it was 2 teachers who worked with the student with corrective reading. You can see in the blue, this is what they were saying when I asked those questions. So on the word attack part of corrective reading, they said, when the student makes an error, has to repeat a line, he doesn't like it. When he gets upset, then he's prone to more errors. Then he skips rows that he has made errors on, so he'll still get points at the end. So they kind of did that talk through, and I would have written much better if I would have ever known I was going to share these in public. But then in green, it allowed us to brainstorm what are some different things that we could think about to customize during word attack that might make this successful for him. So I'm not going to read the rest of it, but you get a sense of how this lent itself to this notion of landing on an intensified plan for a student. So when we think about this piece of MTSS and individualized supports and customized plans and students with significant labels, big labels, you can take any of these pieces, the membership and participation indicators. You could use any of those indicators in the same way I've just talked through the curricular and instructional pieces. So, you know, is there difficulty with this particular part, transitioning between classes? Then use that as a, you know, what does it look like? Or is there frustration? Or what does the behavior look like? And what might we do differently? The last part is a little bit more of a generic planning form if you don't use the templates that I shared with you. And just to enlarge those a little bit, you could be asking, what's the content area instructional routine? What typically do all students do? This student can currently do X, and then how could they arrive at the same routine? So is it different alternative means? And then what supports might that be done or might need to take place, and then by whom, where, and how. So you could make a generic routine planning form as well. Let me pause there. Okay, I see, Beth, I see that you're putting the link to the folder. Great, super. And please come back to it. I forgot, I didn't think about dropping those templates in, but I'm happy to share the ones that have been created to date for you to spin off of if you'd like. Did any questions come up?
Not that I can see. I just wanted to point out that if people missed this morning's keynote with Chris Lemons, this complements it really, really well. So
Great.
right on. You guys must have met and chatted. So.
Right. Right.
So I just would recommend that to people who missed it. It'll be on our website by next week.
Okay, awesome, Beth. Thanks. I love that you guys are taping and making those available. That's awesome. All right, then let me lead into this last part. I told you I was going to bookend with this. So you could be thinking about lessons learned, right? The equity report card. And I just want to show you 3 small excerpts. All of these excerpts are from larger bodies that were part of kind of a mini documentary that's on the swiftschools.org shelf. And it's called Whatever It Takes. Those of you who have been in and around the Portland public area will recognize some of your schools and colleagues. But I'm just going to show you 3 little clips that really get at, first, that piece of membership, second, that piece of participation, and woven in that piece of learning. So this one is, all of these are only about 2 minutes long, because then I'm going to put you into, or invite you into small groups. So this one's on Lily Belongs. So take a listen.
Lily belongs. All right, everyone has a worksheet. Number 1, we have all been convinced by others to buy or do things. Who with the list below usually is best at convincing you? Who is second?
Every student has the right to receive instruction with our age-appropriate peers in a general education setting, and it's our job to figure it out. It's not the student's job to figure it out. It's the adult's job to figure it out. And it's hard sometimes. It's all the adults are the ones that get in the way, right? It's not the kids. The kids don't ever get in the way. The kids live up to your expectations. So if you expect them to be peers with each other, they're peers with each other.
How do you think respect plays a role in someone being able to persuade you? Lily, what do you think? Do you think it's easy?
Easy.
So you think you could convince Jackson to give you his last piece of gum? No. But you guys are good friends, aren't you?
Yep.
Yep, that's what I thought. Okay. You sit right here. Lily wants to
I think Lily belongs to our classroom because she is wonderful and she likes to make friends and she is nice to everybody. She respects everybody around her. She respects the teachers, she respects her things, and it shows us like she's like a role model for us.
You have a good day. You are Yeah.
I mean, I don't think we would have had it any other way, right? I mean, it's just socially, she's just another kid in the crowd, which is a really big deal for us, right?
This is my third year teaching, and I think before this year and working with Lily and some other students in my class with these severe disabilities, I probably would have said there is a separate place for some students to learn, but I really honestly feel that general education setting is the place for all students to learn. I feel like not only do they benefit from being together with their peers, but I think the peers really benefit from that as well.
Well, I met her first last year in math class. She was at a different table and I thought, oh, maybe I can meet a new friend because I'm not really that social, but she's just really funny and good to be friends with her.
It's hard to explain, but with that problem that we're doing on the board, when she does that and I can help her with that, it helps me understand more about what we're doing.
Now I want to introduce you to Jacob. Oops. To Jacob.
This is your X, this is your Y, this is your M. Jacob is a student with autism and he also has some attention needs. Jacob, we're gonna, okay, 10:05, but you need to use the clock. You don't need to use the computer. One of the reasons Jacob is finding so much success and having so much progress is because we were giving him more responsibility and he's learning that he can handle that responsibility. I think in the past it was maybe taken for granted maybe that he would need someone on him all the time, constantly telling him what to do, and we're finding that he doesn't need that. I like to float around and I like to work with as many students as possible because first of all, I don't want Jacob to feel, or any student that I'm working with to feel that I'm just there for them and that they're kind of singled out. And I want every kid in that classroom also to be comfortable coming to me for anything. I absolutely think that if I was next to him all the time, it would be a barrier. It would kind of hinder his progress with social interaction with other students. Okay, so put one underneath that.
Segregating autistic students, that's the most dumbest and pathetic excuse that I can ever think of. Because they want to get along with the other classmates. It's just like segregation and apartheid. And if this was ever like an autistic school that would be segregated from just a normal school, I would probably feel very sad.
My family has been in this community for over 100 years. I graduated from historic school building in 1946. My fear was that he was going to be someone that was going to have to be guided and directed his entire life. And that's not the case. I believe he's going to make a difference in his world. And my hopes and dreams are that he has a happy and productive life.
And
This is your
lastly,
X.
I want to share this educator with you. It works with Ashley.
Multiple access points. When I'm planning for a lesson, I try to give my students multiple access points.
This involves different ways of visualizing the material. I know some students learn better by reading, so I make sure that there's an element of reading in there. Some students will learn better if they write it afterwards. Some students need to see it. Some students need to touch it. Sometimes it may feel like a circus, but it's trying to meet the needs of every student in the class.
You will be getting a circle magnet to hold the train or bus onto the Newton scale. This is a new piece of equipment you're going to learn to use. What it does is measure force.
I've worked with Ashley for 2 years now. I taught her in 7th grade science and now in 8th grade science. It was difficult for her to learn how to use the eye gaze machine. Once we started doing that, I started making notebook files so she can look at and switch between screens. The eye gaze has definitely helped her to become more a part of the class.
I want you to write a question for Ashley. I want you to, okay, I'm going to give you a marker. We need to try to help her figure out if the new ramp is going to have more or less. So will the new ramp have more or less effort?
A or B less? I'm not sure what the answer is.
She'll work with her peers, and she will also be able to go around to different lab stations. So she is capable of learning grade level content as it's relevant. Having students like Ashley with severe disabilities in my classroom benefits every student because they see what the real world is like. They're going to be out in society with people who have different challenges than them. But the more that you are exposed to people with different challenges, different disabilities, the more you're able to show compassion and to help each other out.
All right, thank you. I am recognizing our time, but I would love to give you an opportunity to say out loud things that you're thinking about with others. Beth or Lisa, do we have the availability to have groups of like 4?
Yep, right now I have them at 5, just in case anybody drops, but I can recreate them a little smaller. Well, it says 4 to 5.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. Let's spend at least 7 minutes. I'm so sorry. I was hoping for at least 15, so I was a little winded or long on my words, but let's spend at least 7 minutes. And if you just want to share something you're thinking about, something from the report card, the presentation, lessons learned, or the video, we invite you in. If you'd like to just personally take a step back and do your own reflection, you're welcome to do that and stay in the main room by not joining the room. Whatever's most comfortable for you.